Shabbat Shalom. So a few years ago, there was this big phenomenon that came from Netflix, which was about Marie Kondo, who taught us to embrace empty spaces, to discard what doesn't feel good to us. And maybe some of us listened. I had to in my 500 square foot Netflix apartment. New York apartment. Sort of the same. But Jewish tradition has long understood that emptiness is more complex than just throwing away what doesn't bring you joy. And this week's Parsha, actually if we look at the last 2 weeks' Parshiot, reveal how emptiness, specifically an empty pit, became the catalyst for one of our tradition's most remarkable transformations. In last week's Parsha, we witnessed one of the most dramatic moments in Joseph's story. It was his brothers' betrayal. They were consumed by jealousy over their father's favoritism and over Joseph's prophetic dreams that they stripped him of his famous coat and threw him into a pit. And this week, we see the remarkable conclusion of this ordeal as Joseph stands before Paro, transformed from prisoner to prince. So when the Torah describes this pit that Joseph was thrown into last week, it's a pretty simple description. The Torah says, they took him, Joseph, and cast him into the pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. So let's break apart this verse a bit. We might imagine that Joseph found himself in a dry but sort of safe place. It wasn't a place that he could stay alive, and he surely wouldn't be able to hydrate to stay alive. But it seemed like he had the potential to live and not drown in the pit for maybe a few days, 36 hours. But Rashi paints a different picture for us. The verse tells us the pit was empty and there was no water in it. So surely there's a reason. Why do we need to know that the pit was both empty and there was no water in it? Rashi says that this is because there were snakes and scorpions in the pit, so it actually was dangerous. Joseph couldn't stay there safely. So the pit was empty, but the pit was deadly. Joseph, who was this new prisoner, was both in emptiness and in active peril. Rashi's interpretation isn't merely about dramatic effect. He highlights this duality, empty yet deadly. And he's teaching us about the nature of crisis. Sometimes what appears to be a simple absence, a lack of something that we need, masks a more complex reality. Joseph couldn't see the serpents in the darkness of the pit, and we too often can't fully grasp the true nature of challenges until we experience them, until they're in our midst. Dr. Aviva Zornberg offers another layer of understanding to this pit. She notes that the Hebrew word for empty, which is rik, points to something beyond physical emptiness. For Joseph, this pit represents a void of relationship, stripped of himself, his coat of many colors, separated from his father's love and betrayed by his brothers. Yet, Zornberg argues, it's precisely this emptiness that creates space for Joseph's transformation that we're about to see. It's like a seed that first must decompose in the earth before it can sprout. Joseph's descent into emptiness becomes the conditions for his eventual rebirth as a leader. So you might ask, where does Rashi get this knowledge that the pit was full of creatures? He gets it from the Talmud, which says this pit was full of creatures, and right afterwards, the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat talks about the laws of Hanukkah. Specifically, that we are required to place our Chanukiot, our Hanukkah lights by our doorways so that everyone can see the light coming in and we can benefit from the lights. This juxtaposition, it's not a coincidence. Both narratives speak to moments of transition. Just as we place our Hanukkah lights at the threshold between the darkness of the winter months and the light of our Chanukiot, Joseph's pit became his gateway between bondage and freedom. Like the Hanukkah lights that pierces the darkness at our entryways, Joseph's descent into darkness preceded his emergence into light. And Joseph comes to his first moments of light in this week's Torah portion. After no one in Pharaoh's palace was able to interpret his disturbing dreams, Pharaoh calls Joseph out of prison. Not just out of prison, but Pharaoh says, Joseph, I need you to shave. I need you to change your clothes. I need you to come out a new person and then come and interpret my dreams. This requirement was not just to interpret his dreams, but also cleaning himself up. It signifies this transition that we also see on Hanukkah. Joseph's transition from the darkness of the pit and imprisonment to the light ahead of him, which was leadership and freedom. Joseph had both a physical transformation and a spiritual one too. There's a Hasidic teaching by the Ishbitzer Rebbe who teaches that when Joseph was rushed from the pit by the Egyptians, the Hebrew word that's used is vayiritzuhu. He was rushed. But the way that the Ishbitzer Rebbe reads it, Joseph was nitratzeh. He was pleased. Joseph, according to this reading, felt joy, not despite his suffering, but because of it. He understood that each pit, whether it was filled with scorpions or the loneliness of prison, it was necessary for his own journey and transformation. So this transforms our understanding of Joseph's story. Those moments of darkness, the pit, the prison, the years of waiting, they weren't just obstacles to overcome, but they were actually essential gateways to his eventual destiny. Like the Hanukkah lights that we place at our doorways, sometimes we too need to stand at this threshold of darkness and light to recognize what our purpose is in our own journeys. As we kindle our own Hanukkah lights this week, standing in our own doorways between the dark outside and the light inside, we might reflect on Joseph's journey through the pit. What empty spaces in our lives feel threatening? What voids might actually be gateways to growth? Perhaps like Joseph, we can discover that our moments of greatest emptiness can become the foundations for our most meaningful transformations. Shabbat Shalom.